So, this is going to be a rough draft, a very, very rough draft of me talking about the merits and flaws of the Electoral College in America. I had to write a paper about this for feminism, and somehow it just came out to be like a really good paper. Like, I fucking killed it. So, I'm gonna just read from that, We'll talk about it. Hello, hi, it's me. I have my paper. So, the Electoral College. What is the Electoral College? The Electoral College is an institution in America. It's how we elect the president. The thing is that the president doesn't get votes from people. The president gets votes from states. The states allot the votes to the president. And so states have different number of votes because they have different populations, but it's not directly proportional because every state gets 2 votes to start with, just like they get 2 senators in the Senate to start with. So it's bullshit, and it's kind of terrible, and I hate it, but people like it. And in writing this paper, I found that it does actually have some merit. Like, there's some good to it, and I hated reading that, and I hated writing about it, but it's what I had to do. I was very tired. So hi. So some opponents of the Electoral College would say that it's unfair because it allocates more votes to smaller states proportional to their population than it does bigger states, because they get that baseline 2 Electoral College votes. And so that was built into the Electoral College originally by the Founding Fathers to make sure that the smaller states don't get bullied by the bigger states, because the states were always at war with each other for no fucking reason, I guess. So that's the reason behind that. But what I actually found, I found a paper about this, and it with a mathematical analysis of how much votes actually counted in elections. And it actually found that in elections, the Electoral College grants bigger states with more voting power than it does the smaller states, which is directly contradictory to what the founders had planned. And you may wonder how the math on that works out, and it's actually because the voters in big states have a less proportional chance of casting a deciding vote in their election because there's so many of them, but because they're in their bigger state, they have more Electoral College votes. That actually works more toward building the presidential candidates majority of the Electoral College. So the Electoral College actually grants citizens of bigger states with more voting power than it does citizens of smaller states. And then I think that's it. For that, at least. Hi. Hi. I took the paper out so that I could just read from it. So, as aforementioned, the author of this paper finds that citizens of larger states have more voting power than citizens of smaller states, immediately contrary to the purpose of the Electoral College. A voter in New York State has 3.312 times the voting power of a voter in the District of Columbia. Yeah. So these sources that I found online, like they took this very clear stance on the Electoral College and like whether or not it was good or fair. Um, and so they made it clear that the Electoral College infringes upon American democracy by not adhering to the idea that everyone should have an equal say as to who should lead the country. Both of these analyses find that citizens of larger states have more voting power than citizens of smaller states. And one author is sure to point out in his work that modifications to the Electoral College only shift the disadvantage in the other direction. And so, this paper that I wrote was actually a lit review. So the idea is to find sources on a topic and sort of decipher what they say, like close read them and find what they say, and like put these works and these authors like in conversation with one another. So when I chose the Electoral College as like my topic, I found these sources that were saying the Electoral College is trash, and I was like lit, they're right. Um, and so then I was like, well, I need to find some dummy saying something nice about the Electoral College just to be like, but here's a different perspective. Um, and for the longest time, I was not finding that. And then I found this paper, and it was just like a very sincere take on the Electoral College. And so it was just crazy to read it because like they made points, like they had, like I agree, but also fuck the Electoral College. So that put me in quite the pickle. Um, but yeah, so this writer just makes the argument that the Electoral College bolsters American democracy instead of impeding it the way it actually, I would say it does. But we'll get into that. Oh, oh fuck. Hi. So this dude, Gary Glenn, makes his argument, makes his plea for the Electoral College. And I said in my paper that he argues that the Electoral College encourages more support behind the eventual winner. He said in his paper, the Constitution requires the winner to have a majority of Electoral College votes. Because that is hard to do, the Electoral College narrows the field of candidates considerably from what it would otherwise be. I say, because the Electoral College requires the candidate to receive statewide support in a lot of states, the number of people who could realistically run for and win the title of the presidency is substantially lessened. In an election where the candidate who receives most of the popular vote, more than any other candidate, that candidate can win with 30%, 15%, or possibly even 5% of the vote. A national popular vote opens up the field of candidates to any American with a substantial following. And so maybe you're thinking, okay, well, what if we limit it so that the winner of the election has to have at least 40% of the popular vote, so that they can't win with like 30 or 15. But Glenn like points out the Electoral College like does better than that all the time. The like Clinton won with like 42%, and that was like a historic low. So like it's usually like 48, 47, 49%, or like a majority of the popular vote. So how could allowing somebody with 40% of the vote, take the presidency, how could that be any more democratic? How does that work? And he's not wrong. I hate the argument, but he's right. And so what I also found interesting about Glenn's paper, it was kind of a really good read. He actually speaks to critics of the Electoral College, like contemporary critics of like me, like people who say, oh, let's have a popular vote. Like he speaks to them, speaks to us, speaks to me. He says that he calls them out for missing the point, that though sometimes, rarely, a candidate can win the Electoral College without winning the popular vote, the Electoral College is responsible for the fact that any candidate can ever receive a majority of the popular vote. The Founding Fathers, argues Glenn, may have mischaracterized the nature of the American presidential election under the Electoral College, but the founders' analysis is deeper and hence better political science than that of their critics, and their remedy better preserves democracy. So, he's throwing shade. Like, that's all that is. And I want to say he's wrong, but he's like not, you know? And so I got toward the end of writing this paper, and there was this like moment of going, all right, well, okay, who's right? Like, who am I gonna say I agree with? And I came to, like, initially I was like, oh, well, Glenn's right. Like, he had clapbacks. He was calling people out. Like, it was direct. Like, he was talking to the other authors for me. But then I thought about it, and I was like, well, that doesn't mean that these other people are wrong. The ones who did the, like, mathematical analysis that, like, no, a person in New York has 3 times the voting power of somebody in DC. Like, that's a real thing. Like, they aren't wrong, and, like, neither of these works is wrong. And I still don't know how to, like, synthesize that, to say that the Electoral College is unfair, it is undemocratic, because these people have more voting power or less voting power than someone else, or that somebody can win with more people not wanting them to win the presidency. Like, that seems wrong. Like, that's wrong, right? But also, it's the reason that, you know, we only vote in a field of 2 candidates, or maybe 3 or 4 candidates, and not like 7. Like, how can we have a sitting president with 30% of the national support behind them? There's no answer. And that's everything. There's just no answer at the end.